we would consider modern political Zionist thought. So any comments on Pinsker before we switch gears and go to Jabotinsky?
Pinsker identified the problem. He summarized the problem. He explained why the problem exists. And he provided a solution, a kind of a roadmap to how the problem could be solved. I thought it was a brilliant essay.
Yeah, he's very good, and that's why this essay is whenever you study Zionism, this is one of the first things you read, because Pinsker is really viewed in many ways more than Herzl as the first real theoretician. What he does not do, and this is not a criticism, but what he does not do is come up with a concrete, systematic and strategic way of bringing this about as a reality. That happens later on with Herzl and others. But absolutely, as a declaration, as a thesis, it's powerful stuff. Okay, let's go to Jabotinsky, page 556. Just want to say a couple words about Jabotinsky before we start. Jabotinsky thought that Zionism, he was a journalist and a writer, a very smart guy, like a lot of these people, and he felt that Zionism could mean only a bold Herzlian political struggle for a state. Again, religion was not really on his radar. He didn't grow up religious, wasn't that interested in religion. He was interested in the political movement of Zionism. That's why the thinkers tonight, I'm grouping them together because they represent a certain type of Zionist: political, non-religious, and militant. And I don't say that in a negative way. He said that colonization, and we're going to read something that he submits to the Palestine Royal Commission in 1937, because the British, as their empire was falling apart all over the world, had different people speak to them. And Jabotinsky was one of the people who spoke on behalf of the Jewish community about Zionism and the Jewish state, and that's what we're going to look at now. But the idea of colonialism was not necessarily a bad thing in 1937. We don't think of colonialism in a great way right now, but that's one of the criticisms of some people on the left about Zionism. Zionism is racism. Zionism is colonialism. Whether they're right or wrong, Jabotinsky was perfectly comfortable talking about Zionism as a colonialist movement. And I think in some ways, he's also doing that to try to speak in a language the British would understand. But he says, and I'm 558 now, just sort of the introduction, he says that colonization and everything else depended on political achievements and ultimately, therefore, on power. What we're going to see next week, Pinsker focuses on the national, and Jacob, this is sort of to your point, he focuses on self-consciousness, nationalism, and laying out what the problem is, and sort of a general trajectory that the Jewish people need to go. He doesn't focus so much on the idea of power, political power. He focuses more on getting the hell out of there and creating a safe haven for Jews in trouble. Jabotinsky, first of all, wrote 50 years later. So Zionism was a much more developed movement at this point, much more viable. There was political Zionism. We had the Haganah and the Palmach. We had the Irgun. We had the Stern Gang. We had lots of different opinions about how to approach Zionism and create an actual state, which Pinsker, wasn't able to do. And you had tension between Chaim Weizmann and some of the political Zionists with people associated with the Irgun and the Stern Gang, and they felt we needed to take action, violent action against British soldiers and British police, etc. Like a lot of movements do this when they're fighting for independence. But Jabotinsky, as we're going to see, was very focused on power. And again, I'm trying not to be negative, but Buber, for example, when we read him next week, had a very different take. And for him, he was a Zionist. He moved to Israel. He was a professor at Hebrew University, but he believed in a binational state. He believed that the strength of the Jewish people was not in power it was in other things that we're going to be looking at. But Jabotinsky was very focused on power, and Jews needed to have power if we were to achieve a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state. Jabotinsky believed in rapid mass immigration to Palestine and in major dependence on Jewish military and police units. So we're going to see, Harriet, one second, that he did not, Weitzman and some of the other political Zionists of the time, they were more trusting of the British. They were willing to let the British soldiers and the British police officers help to bring about, peace in Palestine and a Jewish state. Jabotinsky wanted a Jewish army. He wanted a Jewish police force. He wanted Jewish civil servants. That was his very concrete way, building on Pinsker's ideas of auto-emancipating ourselves, of fully empowering ourselves, so we're not dependent on the Gentile. We're not dependent on the British. Weitzman thought that nothing could really be done without the British, their consent, and he wanted a policy of a very careful colonization. Jabotinsky was much more militant. He wanted direct action. What ultimately happened, I think, based on my own study of Zionism in the 1940s, is it seemed to be sort of a combination of both, that brought about 1948 the recognition of Israel as a state. They had Weitzman and Ben-Gurion and others working the political angle. We have some of that today. They had, the Irgun and the Palmach and the Sternists and others.
Begin.
I'm sorry?
Begin.
Yeah, Begin was, I was going to say Shamir, but I think it was too young. But Begin was one of them, and they were working the military angle. Whether you want to call them freedom fighters or terrorists, that's often, what happens when revolutionary groups try to achieve independence. So I think when we look back, it was probably a combination of both that led to 1948. But Jabotinsky certainly is more on the direct action side. He didn't believe in patience. He didn't believe in reliance on others. Like Pinsker, he believed that we needed to do this ourselves. Harriet, would you hand the mic to Harriet, whoever had it last?
I'm just curious as to who selected these people to represent the Jews. How were they selected, or did they self-select?
You gotta hold that next to your mouth.
I'm curious as to how these particular men were selected.
I don't know. They were all different.
Or did they self-select?
They were all different. Many of them were writers, and they became well known as writers. Some were political figures, some were rabbis.
But they were addressing...
Judah Magnus was an American Reform rabbi who moved to Israel, became the first chancellor of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So some were recognized as leaders because of their positions, and some were recognized as leaders just because of their publications or their speaking.
Because they were speaking before bodies of other diplomats.
I mean, it was all different. It was...
They were writing, they were publishing.
Yeah, they were publishing and writing.
They were lecturing, they were speaking, they were meeting people, they were trying to build organizations.
I mean, I would say I don't know for sure, and again, we're covering 100 years here. But when African Americans were fighting for civil rights in the 60s, Martin Luther King would go from church to church and synagogue to synagogue, and he would speak all over the place, and he would write. Malcolm X did the same thing. So, you have to imagine they were speaking to lots of different groups. We're going to be reading part of Jabotinsky's speech to the British, to the Palestine Royal Commission. So how he became a leader at this point, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
So Jabotinsky picks up on Pinsker, the physician, and Pinsker's analogy to the problems of the Jewish people being a kind of sickness, which I thought was a great analogy. And Jabotinsky picks up on that in the formation of Betar, an organization dedicated to trying to change the diasporic attitudes of sort of cowering and passivity, and to give Jews a new direction and a new sense of pride in who they were and what they were, and a new direction in how to bring that to reality, and how
Yep.
to bring the state to reality. So he also concentrated on individuals and trying to build a movement of change with individual people by instilling a kind of Jewish pride in people.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I agree. However, there has been scholarship in recent years in Israel, of all places, that critiques some of Jabotinsky's writings and others like him, and says a lot of those ideas are actually, I think one of the books that does this is called The Jew's Body, and I forget the name of the author. It's an American scholar. But one of the criticisms is that a lot of those ideas are actually internalized anti-Semitism. The idea that the diaspora is weak. The Jews who live in the diaspora are pale and bookish and frail, and all we do is hover over books all day long. And that actually was not totally accurate. There were plenty of Jews who were strong and who lived in fields and were carpenters and what have you. So some of the scholarship critiques some of that as reflecting internalized anti-Semitic attitudes in their own writing. But yes, that is one of the ways of looking at Jabotinsky, like Pinsker, focusing on Jewish pride and empowerment. Okay, if you publish enough, someone's going to critique you for something. So, okay, go to page 560 and 561. And actually, some of this I read on Rosh Hashanah morning. So if you look on 560 in the second paragraph, he talks about 3 generations of Jewish thinkers. So he's talking about like 60 years, probably going back to Pinsker, of different Zionist thinkers talking about, what is the problem, with the Jews? And he says that they've all kind of come to the conclusion, again, I think this is arguable, but this is his point, that the cause of our suffering is the very fact of the diaspora. So he doesn't say Jews are sick, the way that the physician Leo Pinsker says it, but he says that the very fact of the diaspora is the cause of our suffering. Just being in the diaspora is the reason we are in pain and we are in such distress. And he amplifies that at the bottom of the page. He says the phenomenon called Zionism, because there were a lot of Zionists already at this point, all over the place, left, right, religious, secular. He says the phenomenon called Zionism may include all kinds of dreams, a model community. That's sort of what Buber will talk about. Hebrew culture, that's a Chad Ha'am. I want to talk about that next week. Perhaps even a second edition of the Bible. But all this longing for, and this is where he was similar to Pinsker in kind of denigrating the spiritual stuff. All this longing for wonderful toys of velvet and silver is nothing in comparison with that tangible momentum of irresistible distress and need by which we are propelled and born. It's good writing. It's powerful writing. It's a bit, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a bit dramatic. But what he seems to be saying is that all of these other types of Zionism, he's kind of dismissing them. Again, and this is my read of it, but I think some of these more militant political secularist thinkers are kind of dismissive of some of the other ones. He dismisses the idea of the model community. He dismisses the idea of Hebrew culture, the idea of writing a second edition of the Hebrew Bible. And in some ways, I think he's talking about the rites and rituals of Judaism when he talks about toys of velvet and silver. It could just be a metaphor, but he's talking about the fluffy stuff. And he's saying none of that really matters. What really matters is the tangible momentum, this drive to have a Jewish homeland, to have a Jewish state where we have our own military, our own government, our own police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to go on. If you have any questions, you just hold them for a second. Richard, can you hold yours for just 1 second? So again, he doesn't use the metaphor of sickness or the word sickness, but he also thinks that the diaspora is not a good place for Jews to be. And then here in the second paragraph of page 561, this is what I shared on Rosh Hashanah morning that I think gets to the heart of his thinking. He says, and again, he's talking to the British government. about why they should give Jews autonomy in Palestine. Yes, we do want a state. Every nation on earth, every normal nation, beginning with the smallest and the humblest, who do not claim any merit, maybe he's thinking of the Serbs or the Armenians, any role in humanity's development, they all have states of their own. That is the normal condition of people, for a people. Yet when we, the most abnormal of peoples, and therefore the most unfortunate, ask only for the same condition as the Albanians enjoy, to say nothing of the French and the English, then it is called too much. So let's hold this for a second. So, he was a really good writer, and he was, I can't think of the word, when you're a very good public speaker, he was a very good orator. And he's writing in a very emotional way, and he doesn't use the word sickness, but he does use the word abnormal. And he says that the cause of our suffering, the cause of our problems, is that the Jewish people are not a normal people. All normal peoples have a state of their own. That's what he says. And Jews don't. We don't have a state of our own. Even the Albanians, are ultimately going to get a state of their own. So for him, the only way to become normal is to have a state. That's what he's saying to the British. Now, whether that should be the goal of the Jewish people, that is very much an arguable point. And Buber will disagree with this vehemently next week. When the Jewish people in the book of Kings ask the prophet Samuel, demand a king, Samuel says, I don't know, we're a nation of priests. We're a chosen people. We're a light unto the nations. We don't want to be like everyone else. They get what they want. Amcha, the Jewish people always get what they want. And a lot of bad things happen, after that. After Saul, David, and Solomon, there's a civil war. And the Jewish nation, completely falls apart. Many people like Buber and others say, part of our genius, part of the reason we're still around is precisely because we're not like all other nations. So again, it's nothing we have to decide now. I'm just highlighting the fact that Jabotinsky doesn't say we're sick, but he says we're not normal. And if we would only be normal like all of these other nations or nationalities, Irish, Serbian, Albanian, Turk, whatever, would be in a much better position. Again, is the goal of the Jewish people to be like everybody else? That's something for us to talk about. We don't have to resolve that now. But he wants us to be normal. And that was, again, one of the cornerstones of political Zionism, trying to create a normal people because we were in a state of decay, we were in a state of sickness, or we were in a state of abnormality. Richard, you had your hand up before?
Yes. Well, he was Russian, and the context of this is in Russia there were terrible pogroms. The main one was in Kishinev.
Actually, I think he was Ukrainian, or he was born in Odessa. It doesn't matter. Go ahead.
So, he's seeing his people slaughtered, and so, just talking of niceties is not going to get us out of there, and not being able to train our own people to resist, to arm them, that's the only way. Mm-hmm. So, I think he was responding to what's happened in his area of the world.
Yeah, I
don't
agree.
think it's really
and I think that's why he
unusual,
spoke. I think that's why he spoke so much and became kind of an icon, a hero to the Jewish resistance movements in the 30s and 40s. Like Begin, Shamir, the Irgun, the Sternists, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, he becomes this iconic figure in what is quote-unquote the Jewish right. But certainly he was a major figure for the resistance movement. Okay, let's go on to some more of his writing. I want to stay in that same paragraph for a minute. If you go a little bit further down, he says, we have got, and remember, it's 1937. Hitler's in power. Fascism is raging, across Europe. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. The Nuremberg laws are already in effect. He says, we have got to save millions, many millions. And he was prescient in that way. We're not talking about hundreds or thousands. We're talking literally about millions. And unfortunately, 6 of those million never got out. I do not know whether it is a question of rehousing 1/3 of the Jewish race, half of the Jewish race, or a quarter of the Jewish race. I do not know. But it is a question of millions. Certainly the way out is to evacuate those portions of the diaspora which have become no good, which hold no promise of any possibility of livelihood, and to concentrate all those refugees in some place which should not be the diaspora. So there's no real future for certain types of Jews in the diaspora. He seems to be talking more about Jews who are not as well educated, not as affluent. The implication here seems to be more the uneducated masses than those living in cities like him, who are writing and working and doing, quote unquote, okay. But for the millions of others, like my grandparents on both sides, get them the hell out of there and get them somewhere safe. Not a repetition of the position where the Jews are an unabsorbed minority within a foreign social or economic or political organism. So again, echoes of Pinsker, legal emancipation is not enough. It's not enough that, that they have, administrative, economic, or political conditions that, seem to be okay. They need a clean break. They need a land of their own. Let's go on to page 564. In the second paragraph, about 5 or 6 lines down, he says that the plan, and again, this is a pretty bold, he did not shrink from the British legislators he was talking to. And I don't know exactly who in the British government, he was talking to, but, he didn't hold anything back. And he says that the plan he is advocating, and he was only one of what I imagine were probably other Zionists that the British invited to address them. He says that his plan should embody the Jewish demand that they should themselves be allowed to form a protecting body in Palestine, or at least a considerable part of it. Especially there should be a very careful selection of civil servants. So unlike Weitzman and others who said, it's enough for the British to keep the army there, to keep their police there. Yes, Jews can become part of the British military, which Jews did in World War I and World War II. Jews can join the police force. But we don't really, at least right away, we don't really need an all-Jewish military. We don't need an all-Jewish police force. Let's do this a little more diplomatically, strategically. Jabotinsky says the opposite. He says that we, meaning Jews, should be allowed to form our own protecting body in Israel. I study Krav Maga. I've done martial arts for over 30 years. Krav Maga was started by a Jabotinsky acolyte, who wanted to empower Jews to defend themselves in the shtetls, not shtetls, in the ghettos and cities in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust, and then eventually made it to Israel. And I forget his name now. But Jabotinsky was talking about Jewish empowerment, not only in Israel, but everywhere. But again, going back to the beginning, he was interested in power. And I'm not saying that in a critical way. For him, without Jewish power, the notion of a Jewish state is just not going to happen. If we have to rely on the British, if we have to rely on some external power, giving us, permitting us to have a state, we need to take we need to take control ourselves, and we need to police our own streets. We need to defend our own borders. We need to, have our own judges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a huge part of Jabotinsky's writing, the idea of Jewish empowerment. Not in terms of national consciousness, that's Pinsker. He's less interested in consciousness and more interested in action. And I think even though I would put Pinsker and Jabotinsky in the same group, Pinsker, I think, is more of a theoretician, and Jabotinsky, I think, is more interested in very concrete ways of making the Jewish state a reality. And after all, he wrote 50 years after Pinsker, and Zionism was much more developed at this point. In 11 years after he wrote this, there would be a Jewish state. All right, let's read a little bit more on page 565. He says, in Palestine, we were threatened with pogroms. We were telling so to the government for years and years. And yet they kept cutting down on the number of troops in Palestine. He's trying to make the argument that, look, you're telling us, don't take the law into our own hands, but you're not giving us enough British soldiers to protect us. And there are all these pogroms in Palestine. And he says, you need to legalize our self-defense. He brings us up about Kenya. Again, Britain was still a colonial power in 1937, even though it was falling apart rapidly. And Kenya was going to become independent soon. I don't know when. And there were British colonists living in Kenya. And I guess evidently the British allowed them to take the law into their own hands to defend themselves against, what was the name of the group in Kenya? They were called the Mau Mau? Mau Mau. He's saying, let the Jews in Palestine do the same thing. Let us protect ourselves. We don't want to wait around, for the British to save us. So, again, like any time you study writers and thinkers, you need to understand the context in which they're writing. And, he's writing in 1937, and he's addressing a colonial power and trying to speak to them in a language they might understand and hopefully be more sympathetic to the plight of the Jewish people in Palestine. But the key here, let me just say one more thing quickly, but the key here is, and he says at the very bottom, and then Jacob, I'll let you take over, the Jews have never been allowed to prepare for that holy duty of self-defense. And he uses the word holy. Not Torah, not Talmud. What is holy for Jabotinsky is having the right to self-defense. And again, it's going back to this idea of power and empowerment, not waiting around, not relying on other people, taking matters into our own hands, and not being the victims of everyone around us. Yeah, go ahead, Jacob.
Thank you, Rabbi. There was a real urgency forming the backdrop of Jabotinsky's actions, writings, thoughts, travels, lectures. He felt this, and probably more so than any other writer or thinker, he felt the impending doom that was about to descend on the Jewish people. And he redoubled his efforts. Everything was directed toward action as quickly as possible. He sensed what was coming. And this was his theme for years prior to this statement in front of the British Commission, that the Jews needed to get out of Europe, that terrible things were coming. He had this idea, this premonition, and it motivated him and his thoughts and his writings and his actions. So I think that fact explains his sort of pushing and his determination in what he did.
Yeah, I agree with you. Let's just look, just in the interest of time, because I want to wrap up, on page 566. He was in some ways a polemicist and very provocative, and I think sometimes his writing was very compelling. And he says on 566, and here he does sort of show that he's willing to have a little bit of patience. He says, I do not claim a Jewish army before there is a Jewish state. We want the Jewish regiment, just as it existed during the war, rendering decent service. So an independent Jewish regiment within the context of the British Army. He says, if in the building of Palestine, sweat and gold have to be employed, let us give the sweat and let us give the gold. If blood has to be shed by the defenders of Palestine, let it be our blood and not English blood. But that suggestion has always been turned down. So, his writing is powerful. He's giving an oral, speech to the British, and he's trying to say, look, let us do the fighting. If blood and treasure have to be expended, let it be ours. And then he says something on 569 that we don't have time to get to in truth, but in my opinion is a blind spot. But I think it would be a blind spot in anybody writing in 1937, where he brings up the Arabs. and he talks about the Arabs in a few places here. Of course, that's the sticking point often in any discussion of Zionism. What about the Arab population that was there, that is there, that will be there? And he says in the second paragraph on page 569, there is only one way of compromise. Tell the Arabs the truth, and then you will see the Arab is reasonable. The Arab is clever. The Arab is just. The Arab can realize that since there are 3 or 4 or 5 holy Arab states, then it is a thing of justice when Great Britain is doing, which Great Britain is doing if Palestine is transformed into a Jewish state. Then there will be a change of mind among the Arabs. Then there will be room for compromise, and there will be peace.
Do you think he believed that, or was he
I don't know.
being naive, or was he trying to curry favor with the British? Oh, the Arabs are great. It's hard for me to imagine he really.
I have no idea. I mean, they were well aware at this time that there were problems. I mean, they were killing each other. Jews were killing Arabs also. So he seems to be saying that if you tell the Arabs the truth, that the Jewish people deserve a majority Jewish country, independent and sovereign, Arabs will come around to recognize that, it's the right thing. They will compromise and there will be peace. And of course, that is not what has happened. I don't know what he thought. Yeah, go ahead, Jacob. Yeah.
Well, to your point, Lee, Jabotinsky actually had a profound respect for the Arab people and the Arab peoples of Palestine. He treated them as equals, and he was better in that regard, more realistic about the Arabs and more respectful toward them than many of the other people in Palestine, like Ben Gurion, who were grappling with this issue.
About the Arabs, I'm saying, come on, logically. I mean, really, who is going to think? Oh, by the way, we'll just take over this country. We'll be nice to you, and don't mind us. It's fine. Look, I'm a Zionist. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying. Well, maybe he was. Maybe you're right. Maybe he was, in my view, would have been blinded by what he thought of Arabs or Arab friends or whatever, that they would somehow say, oh, this is just fine.
I would just...
He didn't really, he's not saying that, because he also famously said that no national movement in the history of the world has ever traded its ideals and goals for indoor plumbing. He understood the Arabs better than most of the other leaders, the other Jewish leaders. He understood their nationalist aspirations, and he treated them like equals.
And yet, many of the people who claim to be disciples of Jabotinsky to this day would like to expel the Arabs, the Palestinians, to other Arab countries and expand the borders of Israel. I'm not saying that's what Jabotinsky wanted, but people who claim the mantle of Jabotinsky's ideas sometimes do that.
I could see respecting them, but not being naive as to what the reaction would ultimately be.
Let me just, it's 8:30, let me just wrap up with a thought, and I'm not trying to be provocative here because I don't think it's that controversial. I think of all the Zionist thinkers in here and all the Zionists of the last 100 or 200 years, I think we would be naive to think that they were all really sensitive and respectful about the rights of Arabs or Palestinians. I think that's just not true. I think some were and some weren't. And I don't know who was and who wasn't. I'm not a scholar of Zionism. I'm just a teacher of this book and a student of Zionism. But I think we have to admit that that Zionists were not always and are not always sensitive of the Arab community and or understanding of their own nationalist aspirations. Maybe Jabotinsky was, but I think a lot of others have not been. And this is not this is not a seminar where we're going to resolve the Jewish-Arab conflict. It's much more an intellectual history of Zionism. But the problem is with us to this day. So next week we're going to look at, I'll just give you the other thinker now, but I'll also send out an email to everyone because again, we had a lot of people who registered and the audio was not working. So if you've already read Buber, just review your writing, your reading. He's going to offer a very, very different take than Jabotinsky. So read Buber and also read Echad Ha'am. I may add one other thinker, but I think 2 is enough based on tonight. I think trying to do 3 of these people in one night is a lot. So read Buber, read the section on Buber, read the section on Echad Ha'am, and next week we'll look at them, and they're going to represent a very, very different way of approaching Zionism, even though both of them were, incredibly important Zionistic figures, particularly Echad Ha'am. And I hope you'll come in person because it's so hard to do this remotely. Yeah.
I liked what you said before, that the Jewish people needed all of these people. They needed all of these ideas and all of these thinkers going into the mix so it could be sifted out and people could decide on the relative merits of these different ideas. I think you hit a very important thing. All of these people were needed, whether their ideas turned out to be, right and followed or wrong and ignored. They were all important to the development of what was to come.
Thank you. Okay. Hopefully see you next Wednesday. Bring friends. We'll see what's going on with this, but hopefully you can come in person. And maybe I'll see you on Shabbat if you guys come on Shabbat.